you that are just
Sorry.
tuning in. That was perfect timing. Hello to those that are just tuning in. We're recording the session, and you will get a copy of the recording afterwards. If you are a weekly pass holder, you will know by now that you will get a library of all the recordings at the appropriate time at the end of the week. This is not quite the last session of the Thursday at the Festival of Trusteeship. Straight after this, in this room, we have a networking session. So if you want to stay for that, you don't have to leave this Zoom room. We'll stop the recording for that though, and we will be courteous enough to give you a little break so you can pop to the toilet and grab a cup of tea if you want to stay for the networking. So that's good. As usual, please stay muted on the call unless you're asked to unmute. It helps to make sure that everyone can hear who is talking clearly. Continue to use the chat function for all of your comments and questions, and I will be feeding those through to the panel at the appropriate stages. Closed captions are available. You just need to enable those from your end. Please feel free to also ignore the chat if you wish to. If you find it too distracting, just close it down and don't engage with it. Just listen to the panel. We've got a fabulous panel for you today, a big panel as well, actually. So keep an eye on everything that they're saying. I just want to say two final thank yous. One to Third Sector, our media partner, for all the support they've given us, and also to Ecclesiastical, who is the headline sponsor for the festival. Their support has meant that this strand, the Aspiring Trustee strand, we've been able to make free of charge to all participants. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to your chair today, which is Fiona. Fiona, over to you.
Thank you, Leon, and thank you everyone for joining us today for our panel discussion from Frontline Volunteer to Trustee. I'm Fiona McCausland, getting on board's Communications Director, and we have a fantastic discussion planned for you today with four excellent panellists who have all been on both sides of the fence, Frontline Volunteers first and now Trustees. And this is a subject close to my heart because I too found my way to trusteeship from doing volunteer work and activism. So I want to give a little bit of context. Our sponsors, Ecclesiastical, conducted some research earlier on this year, actually last month, and they found that in answer to the question, what, if anything, made you want to become a charity trustee? 33% said, I want to take the next step from volunteering. That's a third of trustees asked. And I thought that sounded quite a lot, but actually, now that I've reflected on it, it makes total sense because frontline volunteers are very close to the mission. They clearly have a passion for the mission. They're the absolute kind of beating heart of the charity. And quite often the skills that they've used as a volunteer and the experience they've gained in that role makes them highly qualified to be a trustee. But quite often volunteers don't see themselves as trustees. And similarly, trustees and sometimes charity staff don't perhaps recognise their potential either. Like roles aren't always advertised to volunteers, for example. So how do frontline volunteers make the most of their volunteering experience to join a charity board, and why might you want to think about becoming a trustee? So to avoid death by introduction, I'm going to crack straight into the questions. I'll ask each panelist to give a very quick introduction to themselves when we first come to them, and take it from there. So if I may, I'm going to turn to Rebecca first, Bex, and I'm going to ask, what was it about your volunteering role that made you want to become a trustee?
Hey everyone, yeah, thanks Fiona. So I think for me, it did feel like a natural next step, also with my charity. So I'm on the board of Devon Wildlife Trust, and each Wildlife Trust is part of the wider Federation of Wildlife Trusts across the UK. I did take a sidestep briefly into employment for the trust and then came back out into a voluntary role. And for me, it was about how can I most efficiently use my limited time and resources, energy resources, to have an impact on the cause that I really care about. And when I saw the advert for trusteeship, it really fitted that bill for me. So yeah, that's the answer really.
Thank you. And I wanted to bring Jess in because I'm wondering if there's some resonance there for you because you've worked or you've been involved in the organisation that you're now a trustee for it seems kind of many years. So is that something that you can relate to?
Yeah, thanks, Fiona. Hi, everybody. Yeah, definitely. I think so. I think I am currently a trustee at the World Association of Girl Guides and Girl Scouts. So for those of you who may have perhaps been a brownie or a guide in your youth, we are the organisation that oversees that movement globally with sort of 8.8 million members around 153 countries. But before that, I was also a trustee for Girl Guiding Anglia. So that's the branch of Girl Guiding in the east of England where I live and where I'm based. And I've been involved with the movement, the organisation since I was 10. And I joined myself and got so much out of it as a young person, which really shaped me and shaped my kind of journey, I suppose. So for me, it was definitely something about being able to give back. And to be able to ensure that the organisations are there to be able to support their beneficiaries for many, many years in the future, and playing a small part in that, I think really sort of sparked that interest and that passion for me, definitely.
Thank you. Yeah, that's real. I think that's really interesting. And I just got a follow-up question, and I want to bring Rowan in because I know that she has a lot, sort of also worked with young people. Did you know about trusteeship all the way through your journey through?
Yeah, really interesting, actually. I'm very lucky that Girl Guiding in the UK and across the world is really committed to making sure that the voices of girls and young women are at the heart of all we do. And we've really, really tried to ensure that in every governance role and governance at every level of the organisation, that we give meaningful opportunities for young people to play a part. And I think that's really, really important. So when I joined the board of Girl Guiding Anglia, at that point, I was in my mid-20s, probably. And actually, interestingly, we did have a role that was a dedicated young trustee role. There was someone in that role already. So there were two of us on the board who were sort of in our 20s at that point. And actually, I think for me, it wasn't something I was necessarily that aware of, and certainly didn't necessarily have a full understanding of the responsibilities. But actually being able to take on leadership roles whilst I was still involved at other levels, and whether that be, you know, joining different committees and working groups. I took on some volunteer management responsibilities as a volunteer before I became a trustee. So I think that helped enable me to kind of get a sense of what it would involve and develop some of the skills that helped me as a trustee. And certainly I think from our perspective, making sure that we have that really intergenerational perspective is really important, but making sure that the young people's voices are at the front and centre of all we do.
Absolutely. We had a very interesting session. We've had a couple of interesting sessions about making sure that all those voices are represented and that are equally respected on a board. Rowan, what was it about for you, the volunteering role, that's really sort of made you want to take that next step to being a trustee?
I think I come from it from a slightly different perspective, in that I was volunteering for a youth work organisation as a teacher and loving it. I fell in love with the sector and realised, oh, this is what's missing for me. This is where my practice lies. And I had a gorgeous transition over to the professional side of youth work. But I always had this kind of perception that trustees were this othering. They kind of existed not so much around an organisation, but above an organisation. And they were this scary people that told us what we could and couldn't do. And there was other organisations in Swindon that I really loved, or in Wiltshire, sorry, that I really loved and had a brilliant amount of respect for their practice. And it was actually my CEO of my charity that came to me and said, look, there's this charity called Rise 61. You love what they do. They need a safeguarding trustee. You love safeguarding. Go do. And I said, what do I have to offer? I'm 26. I don't feel like I'm at a stage in my life where I have the practice to sit on a trustee board. And it very quickly was like, oh no, wait, these are the people that need to be on trustee boards. We need to start kind of flipping that switch a little bit, but we don't tell young people that that's a really valid form of volunteering, and that it's not about being a head of a company. It's about having a niche that you care about and can bring to that table. And actually I'm passionate about safeguarding and safeguarding young people, and being able to bring that to a trustee board was really rewarding. And it's just clicked and kind of flown off so quickly that it feels like a massive success. And I want other young people or younger people to have that opportunity.
Yeah, I love that. There's so much there that you've just said that I want to get into. I love the fact that your CEO told you about that and got you to apply for it. And I love the passion that you brought to it and the fact that you want to kind of pay it forward as well. And also the fact that you thought that it wasn't for someone, quote unquote, like you at that stage of your life. So so thank you for sharing that. And I want to ask, kind of move us on a little bit and ask Fanny, kind of going off that slightly, the fact that you had been a volunteer, did it feel like a hindrance or an advantage when you were moving on to the trustee role? Oh, we can't hear you, Fanny.
Can you hear me now? Brilliant. Sorry, I'm on my partner's laptop and he keeps taking over the mic on his phone. I don't understand technology enough to know it, as long as you can't hear his podcast. Anyway, I'm probably the odd one out to ask this, because when you become an elected trustee, which I feel like is very rare in the charity sector for a student union, the kind of line is you don't need any experience besides being a student and kind of being able to bring that to the role. So I think you could become, and we've got many very successful student trustees who have not been involved with the Students' Association previously. So I'm a trustee for the Open University Students' Association. So you can successfully come in and complete that role. But I feel like in a lot of meetings, because we have a lot of external trustees who have not kind of engaged with the association previously, because unless you study at the university, you don't really have a reason to go and engage with random students' unions. It really is an advantage to be able to bring the volunteering side of my role into it. And because I was in a frontline but elected volunteer position again, I've worked, and like Rowan said, been on the kind of other side, and they always felt like they're that other group, they're that very serious people. So being now on the flip side of it, you kind of realize that they are the same kind of people that any other meeting that you go to would be within the charity. So yeah, definitely an advantage to me to be able to bring that kind of unique perspective to the board, and kind of learning skills along the way, obviously, as well.
What would you say the biggest difference is between those two roles? I'm just interested in what you said there around that it definitely is an advantage.
I think the biggest difference to me has been that
Oh, we've lost you again. But no podcast.
Is that working
Yes,
now?
yeah.
Lovely, jubbly. Sorry, I don't normally have tech issues, but there's always going to be one. So I think in my role, when I was Vice President of Engagement, I was always empowered, supported by staff, and kind of feeling like you were serving the student community consistently, like kind of directly the people that the charity was set up to support. And it was all of these exciting projects, and I could come in, I served 2-year terms, so over 4 years I was like, oh, I would love to do this, oh, I would love to do that, this would be really fun. Whereas obviously the trustee role is, I'm 25, I was 24 when I took on the post, so it's the more kind of serious side of it, I guess. So you would get involved, but it wouldn't be we should have a new magazine, because that would be so fun. But equally, it feels to me a bit more like I'm serving the organization a bit more directly, so supporting the staff and supporting the volunteers, rather than by extension supporting the body as well. And I think when you volunteer, you kind of want to give back to your community, and then I now kind of feel like I'm now giving back to the organization that allowed me to give back to my community. That was probably a very twisted way of explaining that, but I think that's been the biggest difference for me.
Yeah, thank you. The circularity of it. I can see that. Jess, you were nodding very vigorously there. Is that something that that chimes with you?
Yeah, I think so. And I think also I'm currently an elected trustee, so it's quite an interesting dynamic actually. When I served as a trustee at the regional level in the UK, that was an appointed role that I applied for. Whereas at a global level, we're all an elected board, so it is quite a different dynamic there. And again, I was just reflecting on those two different roles, being a trustee at different levels of the same organisation, I guess. And I think it's really important to, to make sure that you do have those opportunities to interact and go sort of, back to the floor, if you like. Yesterday evening, I was just at a leadership event that we had in one of our world centres that's in London. So we brought together a group of about 30 young women from 20 different countries all around the world for one of our kind of week-long leadership seminars. And I was asked to go and speak about my journey into governance. And I just think that was such a useful reminder of why it is you do what you do, and really important to always have that opportunity as a trustee to be able to talk to the people on the ground, because whilst you might have been a frontline volunteer or a beneficiary yourself at some point, things change, not least at the moment. Things are changing all the time, and everybody's experience will be different. So having that chance to hear different perspectives and really make sure that you're understanding the impact of maybe decisions you're making, so important, I think, to keep that ear to the ground all the time.
That is a really, really good point, and not one that I'd considered in that light, actually, just that things change. So even if you have had that experience and you haven't been that for 5 years or so, it is going to be really different when, of what's going on at Frontline. Bex, what say you? Hindrance or advantage when you were applying for trustee role?
I think when I was applying, an advantage, because I understood the organisation from a very grassroots level. I think as I moved into my role, I found it a bit of a hindrance because my trustee role was my first role in any kind of governance. So outside of trusteeship, I'm self-employed, I work by myself. I've never really worked in a company. I've worked in a few charities, and so to suddenly be in a role where I was expected to be at governance level, not thinking about operations, not thinking about day to day, was a very big mental shift for me. And I do sometimes wonder, I think it would have been easier if I'd gone into governance at a different charity, because I think then I would have to almost use a different brain and think about that. But having said that, I think I've come into my role a lot more now. So I think it took me a couple of years really to feel like a trustee. And after that, I really got to know the role and practice thinking at a governance level. And now I feel more, again, like it's an advantage because I have that understanding. So yeah.
Do you still volunteer? Do you still do the volunteer role at the charity?
No, so I started out in practical conservation volunteering, and so that was very much about being in place. And recently, I mean, I don't know how well any of you know the Southwest, but especially living in Devon is very difficult because of certain tourism economy. So I've not actually been able to live in Devon full time for about 1.5 years now. So I'm often not in the place, due to certain social diversity reasons, I guess. But and then there is a kind of trickiness when I went from that volunteer role into an office volunteer role, which suited some health needs that I had a bit better. And I think going back to the operational level would be difficult for me. I think something, and reflecting what Jess said actually about how things are changing, that really was a bit of a light bulb moment for me, and thinking okay, it's been six years since I was a frontline volunteer. Things have changed, our organisation has changed. I've seen those changes, I've been part of them, and so I think it would be really beneficial for me to come back to that level.
Thank you. Rowan, slightly different take on it. So not so much about when you're applying for the role, but building on what Bex was saying about managing that dynamic between operations and strategy that you do in, sort of broadly volunteer operations, trustee strategy. How do you navigate that, those two roles, volunteer and trustee, and the change from one to the other? Oh, you're on mute.
Someone has to do it every time, right?
Of course.
Like Bex said, it can be incredibly difficult, where you start at a grassroots level and you're involved in the everyday. As trustees, can we sometimes forget that it's not our job or choice or role to decide what organisations or charities do, but to manage that risk? And I often used to see it before I was a trustee, I would see it as the trustees decide what I do day to day, what my job looks like, what I do, what my volunteering role looks like. They can tell me what time I have to be at a session, what role I take, if I'm doing just dance with young people or swing ball, whatever it may be. But actually it's completely the other end of it, isn't it? And it's about keeping organisations safe. And that can be a real asset, because I know what the frontline volunteer is going through, and you can have empathy for that situation, but you can also have to put yourself back in your own place sometimes and say, I love good practice. I have millions of ideas about how we can have fabulous practice around youth work. That's not my job right now. My job right now is to make sure that the people in their role is to succeed and to keep them safe doing it, to keep them financially safe and manage that risk for them and with them. And sometimes that can be a bit tricky because you have to put yourself back in your box, but it's a learning curve, isn't it? Definitely.
Yeah, it definitely is a learning curve, and it sounds like you that one of the benefits that your board has with you being on the board is that self-reflection that you bring to it, and the fact that you do scrutinize the role that you're bringing to it. There was something that was said in the session, I can't remember which session it was this week, where one of the panelists said, I'm trying to remember the exact words, that the difference between it was about being a trustee and about the difference between serving the beneficiary and serving the charity, and that there was a real difference between those two things. And the trustee role is very much about making sure that the health of the charity is working, as you were saying, about making sure that the safeguarding has really strong policies around it. So yeah, I think that is a really interesting point. Fanny, is that something that you have had similar experience with, those lines between where the volunteering ends and where the board work starts?
Let's hope it works now. Yay. I'm now going to be very paranoid about it for the whole session. Yes, as others were talking, I was just thinking the number of times I'm in my second year of the elected volunteer post now. And in the first year, I would often catch myself when I would start a sentence by, when I was a volunteer, and then I would promptly stop kind of reflecting my past experiences on the people who are in the volunteer roles now, to try and not kind of overshadow them. And it's particularly hard when you're in a trustee role where you did the volunteer role, that worked quite closely with board of trustees on occasions, to not feel like you're still there, and to let them do their role that they were elected to do. But I think on the other end of it, it can also be, and I think that might be, and there is a few of us who have gone from volunteer to trustee within the same organisation. We've been having this conversation at trustee level to make sure that we're also not becoming that board that's just yep, stamp on it, go. Because when you've worked as a volunteer with particularly staff members, but also other volunteers for years and years, you really trust them. And for me, as someone who didn't come in with a massive finance expertise background, and has not been a director of finance, I really appreciate the head of finance person that we have, and I have the utmost trust in her. So kind of the other end of it that I've kind of struggled with at times is not just being oh, Alison did this, so I'm sure it will be absolutely fine, and I don't need to worry about it because I really trust her. So kind of finding that balance, and I don't know if there is any trustee board that has got it perfect. Please do let us know, because I feel like you kind of swing one way or the other, and you're constantly aware of it. So also making sure that you look at it objectively, and that's definitely been a learning curve for me.
I think that is really true. I think there is no perfect, is there? And it's always in flux. It's always tweaking, and and working with people in the room and the environment. Jess, you sound like you've worn an awful lot of hats in the organisation. How do you make sure you've got the trustee hat on when you're in the boardroom, and which bits of the volunteer hat, the brim perhaps, is useful when you're in that role?
Yeah, it's really interesting. I love that analogy. We use it a lot in girl guiding, wearing lots of different hats. I think probably reflecting a bit more on when I was a trustee at the regional level in the UK, and at that point was a Brownie leader myself, week in, week out, delivering sessions, as well as doing a lot of training for the organisation as well, and involved in some of the sort of comms work. So was already wearing quite a few hats, I guess. And I think you're right. I think it's very easy sometimes to sway back into the sort of operational sphere. I think one thing is about remembering that for us, a lot of us were in the same position. We had a couple of external trustees, but the majority of the board were people who were volunteers as well. So having that ability to, in a board meeting and in a discussion, to kind of remind people and be honest and in a respectful way, but actually calling that out. Hey guys, we're really straying into operations here. We don't need to be kind of getting into the detail. We just need to be thinking about the strategic decision, I think, is important, because it is very, very easy to do that. And of course, it's a grey area, right? There isn't that clear-cut line between the two. But I think for me, it was always one of the things that struck me and was quite useful, was thinking about, well, what will the impact of that decision be back on me in my role as, in this case, you know, a Brownie leader, and how will that play out? How will that have an effect? And being able to think that through, particularly when preparing or reading papers, I think is really important, and being able to bring that perspective and that sort of lived experience, but also recognizing that, as I was saying before, every volunteer's experience will be different, and how it might have impacted me in my role in Cambridge might have been very different to someone who was a leader in Norfolk in a very different kind of part of the area. So I think it's also, you know, about making sure that you're bringing in those diverse perspectives, and if you have got perhaps non-volunteers on your board as well, making sure you're listening to them just as much as you're listening to your own volunteers. It doesn't give you a right, I don't think, to have a, you know, more of a say, or to feel like your voice is any more important than anyone else's. And I think it's sometimes slightly tricky when people sort of stray into thinking, well, I'm a volunteer, so I have to know best, and actually being able to recognise that everyone brings a really useful perspective to the discussion is very valuable, actually.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I'm just kind of reflecting on that, the thought that some volunteers might feel that their opinion has an extra weight, because I think I was approaching it perhaps from the other point of view of thinking that you would feel that you didn't have the extra weight because you hadn't always been in the boardroom. So it's really, really interesting to me to hear it both ways. Bex, what learnings have you been able to apply directly, sort of from that volunteer experience to the trustee role?
Yeah, I was just reflecting on something that Rowan said about safeguarding. So coming from a wildlife trust perspective, our beneficiaries aren't quite as clear-cut as a certain like demographic of people. Obviously, we've got people who visit our nature reserves, but you know, you can't just like look at a badger and say that's our beneficiary. It can be quite difficult. But definitely in terms of risk management, you know, having been out on sites and done practical conservation tasks, which, just for additional context, usually means like bashing bracken back or planting bulbs or surveying for butterfly eggs or something. So having had that practical experience in the field has definitely helped me at board level, when I'm just, I guess also when I'm envisaging our network of volunteers and staff, because we have a lot of staff in the field kind of spread out across the county. I can almost envisage them, and knowing them is also quite helpful. And I do really appreciate what Fanny said about remembering that we're there to have kind of a critical friend approach, rather than just like, oh yeah, like it's the same for me when I'm like, oh, Penny's created this paper, oh, I used to work under Penny, so that's done, you know, and just remembering like, okay, no, actually she wants me to look at this. So yeah, but also being able to visualize our network across the county, I think, is really important for me, and just to understand understand the work that goes on at a ground level. Obviously I can only really talk for wildlife conservation, but it can can get very technical, especially in terms of like floodplain management, or when you're working with protected species or introduced species like beavers, for example. There's a lot of scientific kind of background that comes into it. And so for me, being able to take that from the impact in the field on a specific landscape and being able to apply that to board level, I think has been really, really important for me.
Thank you. Rowan, one of the things that was that's occurred to me listening to all of you talk was, do you think that you're typical of volunteers in being able to see that pathway transition? And I'm asking you because it was something that you it was your CEO who put it in front of you and sort of made you see that, yes, you were absolutely the sort of person who needed to be a trustee. Do you think it's something that's typical of volunteers generally, or is there a bit of a barrier there?
I mean, I can only filter it through my experience within the youth sector, but I would say no, only in the terms that when we talk about volunteers working with young people, it can often be well-meaning people who would lack the formal qualifications to go into the youth sector and employment. So they're building up experience and building up that kind of resume of presence, not performance. And quite often these people in the area I work in would come from areas of high socioeconomic factors, of areas of high deprivation, and actually telling them that they're the best person to sit on a trustee board because they know and understand the area that work is taking place in and have invaluable knowledge of that social community. They're not often in a place where they can hear that. We quite often try to, within the organisation I've volunteered for, the organisation I work for, and the organisation I trustee for, we try to have at least one local young person on the board.
Yeah.
To say, you understand the issues that are going on here. You're not here as a part of tokenism, you're here because the skill, the niche that you've got is understanding your area and helping us to contextualise our safeguarding, our risk management, the work that we do and how we keep it well. But that's a really hard persuasion. Like, it's like pulling teeth sometimes because people don't have that kind of self-belief. If I can't remember who said it, sorry, but if you're not used to the boardroom's a kind of scary place to be in, and you're surrounded by people who are used to being in boardrooms and are easy and happy to fill that space. So actually you kind of try to encourage them and encourage myself as well to say like that one thing that's going to leave a lasting impression without sounding a bit silly, and practicing those terms and kind of warming up to it. But these are the most valuable moments.
Yeah.
Those are the moments that change and shift perspective. So working with young people I do a lot of work around youth voice, and in my professional role, and I'm sorry I'm slipping over, but where we want young people to join us on trustee boards, to have young trustee boards, to have young parish councils, and all of these things. And actually there's an education there that we cannot afford to miss, because, and I know Becca put the young trustee movement into the chat there, but actually if we don't educate people on what trusteeship looks like, how are they ever going to know that they're not perfect for it? But we don't do that education for, like, maybe it's my sector, it's specifically bad for it, but I didn't know anything about it before I came into it, and I had both volunteered and worked professionally in the sector. But young people, or younger people, we don't kind of freely throw that knowledge out for them to look at. We want to sound smart, so we create barriers, and that breaks my heart, because there are people way better than me to be on boards, but they don't believe in themselves. That's gutting.
It is really gutting, and I think the things that you're talking about there just have there's sort of labels that we can put on and things that we try to address as barriers, particularly within getting on board. Like, it's not just about getting people onto that board, but then including them and making sure that we've made everything accessible when they've got there. And yeah, it is really lamentable to hear that it's still going on. It's just layer upon layer of just not making it easy to have the right people in the room and the right voices heard.
Exactly.
And there's a question that's just come in from Janet, which I'm going to just divert onto. I'm 2 weeks into my trusteeship of a small local community charity and have been asked to attend a symposium on behalf of the board, but within an area that I'm involved with as a volunteer. Any recommendations on how I can ensure to keep my trustees hat on? I'm going to give that one to Jess, the wearer of many hats, and see what she says on that one first.
How did I know that, Fiona? I just had a feeling. Yeah, I think that's really interesting. First of all, thank you and congratulations on your new trustee role. How exciting. I think I would say, from my perspective, certainly if this was sort of me in that position, thinking about remembering that strategic focus of the trustee role and thinking about the responsibilities of a trustee, as we've talked about, in terms of the kind of overarching management of things like finance or risk, rather than getting too sort of bogged down in the detail, I guess, and thinking about how that particular area or topic is actually only one of many things that you'll be looking at as a trustee. And so balancing those different competing priorities or pressures is often one of the biggest challenges, I think, of being a trustee, is you just can't do everything. The other thing I would say, and this is probably just good advice in general, is don't worry if you don't know the answer, or you're not quite sure. I think it's always about being willing to sort of perhaps admit that you don't necessarily know, or maybe caveating that a lot with your own experience, and actually, as I said, everyone's experience is going to be different. So I think they're probably my tips. Perhaps someone else has something to offer as well.
Thanks, Jess. I think that is really, really good advice. Yeah, doesn't matter if you don't know, that's absolutely fine to say that. And keeping the strategic focus. Fanny, what would you say to that? Do you have anything you'd like to add on that one?
I don't think any of us actually did introductions. We just went straight into it. But I'm in quite a, some would say, weird position where I work for the university now. I didn't when I take up my trustee position, but I'm kind of in this open university bubble in my professional life, and that's okay. So I very often end up in situations where it's like my trustee hat can know this, but my staff member hat isn't allowed. So only half my brain takes in the information, right? I haven't quite worked it out yet. But I would also say that, especially if you're going to like speak to other people, then I feel comfortable kind of letting people know that there are some discussions I might not be able to have, particularly because the two organizations have a financial connection as well. But I would also say that I don't think you have to strictly just keep your trustee's hat on, because I think it's really valuable to share your other experiences as well, because people are probably not just going to go there and just want to hear from the trustee perspective, because I'm assuming that's partly why you've become a trustee in the area, because you've got expertise. And I think anybody in the volunteer sector would be really grateful for any kind of expertise. But also you can talk about your kind of, use examples like we have done throughout this kind of discussion as well, of more practical things, and then reflect that on a more higher level and take it back to your charity if that makes sense on the board.
Yeah, thank you. I hope that's useful, Janet, and yes, congratulations. And I hope your symposium goes really well. That was kind of a side quest. So I'm going to go back to one of the questions that I really wanted to hear from all of you on this. It'd be, what would you like all trustees to know about frontline volunteering and about their volunteers? I'm going to start with Bex.
Sorry, can you repeat the question? I have my brain stuck in the previous question. So what would we like all trustees to know?
Yeah, what would you like all trustees to know about their volunteers and about frontline volunteering? So all the ones who haven't had that experience, who are perhaps, who've come to the trustee board with very many skills, perhaps exactly what's going on at grassroots isn't in their lives.
Maybe not the easiest answer, but I think it's less about knowing things about the volunteers and more about maybe understanding the ways in which they come to an organisation and why they want to engage in the organisation. Like there are lots of different reasons, for example, why someone might volunteer for a wildlife trust. And so I think understanding that there are lots of different pathways to that voluntary role, and also the fact that I think especially when you have maybe larger charities, you've got your on the ground work, and then you've got the enabling work that happens maybe in a head office or smaller offices around the county. A lot of work is done by a lot of volunteers across so many different areas. When we think, I think some board members might think, oh yes, our volunteers, they're doing X, Y, and Z, and actually they're doing the whole alphabet of everything. So I guess I would like to see more trustees understand the breadth of work that volunteers do, I think. And I think secondly is understanding the amount of care that volunteers put into charities. Like the most passionate people I've met about wildlife are volunteers for wildlife charities. Obviously our staff are very passionate, our trustees are also very passionate, but the day in, day out, especially when we're looking at maybe monitoring or certain voluntary roles that require very regular input, the passion there I've seen is just astounding, and I wish more trustees could see that, I guess.
Yeah. And when you say more trustees could see that, do you think there's a sort of a space within just the trustee space generally to make sure that those sort of connections do happen? And I know that lots of charities are amazing about sort of having volunteer days or times they meet up, but should we make more of that within the sector and make that, obviously can't make it mandatory, but just make it something that's sort of normalized?
Yeah, I think I would really like to see that. I think one of the balances that we've been trying to get right on our board is having people that have enough time to give to the trustee role. So when you're bringing in people with a lot of experience or with not a lot of experience, but they might have a lot of commitments, and so it can be difficult to ask people to give up more of their time to do that kind of thing. They're saying, well, we attend quarterly board meetings, we attend 3 different committees, and we read all the papers, and we pick up the phone when something's kind of going wrong, and then you kind of say, oh, how about an extra volunteer day? So I think that would be a challenge for that, that to be aware of. But I think any well-meaning trustee would be up for that, I think. I think just picking up on what some others have said, I think there remains a disconnect between volunteers and trustees, even though trustees are volunteers, right? We are volunteers in our role, but I think I'm pretty sure there are still volunteers for my charity that would hear the word trustee and think, oh my goodness, and flinch away. And I would like more kind of cross. And again, I'm doing this, right? So we've got the board at this level and the volunteers at this level. That's the wrong visuals to be using there, but to have that kind of relationship building across different kinds of voluntary roles, I think would be really important. And I mean, that is something, just thinking practically, we have quarterly volunteer, like across the organization, meetup days, and we try and get as many trustees to those as possible. So I think, yeah, there are those opportunities, and it would be good to have more.
I think so. Definitely having a flatter structure, it's more like that than like that. Yeah. Rowan, what would you like trustees to understand? I think I'm going to borrow Bex's word, understand about frontline volunteering and about their volunteers that they might not know, that might encourage more of that flat structure and transition from volunteer to trustee.
I think Bex hit the nail on the head. We can all feel a little bit hierarchical at times, but it's not someone's here and someone's here. It's a straight line, isn't it? Or it's a bubble around the main organisation that all volunteers fill. So we kind of tell volunteers or tell trustees either or that everyone sits in their box, but the more that we can get people together and get people networking and eating together and having a giggle together, the more that we can create that kind of synergy together. And I guess that's what a lot of you guys do in your daily kind of roles. But I think I'd like to flip it as well. I'm like, what do we want volunteers to know about trustees? And I think there was a beautiful piece of advice I was once given. In a very previous world, I was in the theatre, and one of the pieces of advice I was given is that every time you walk into an audition or an interview, they want you to be the right person. everybody wants you to be the perfect person because you are filling a role, you are solving a problem. And I think we have to tell volunteers that about trustees. They want you to be brilliant. They think you are brilliant. I cannot believe every time that when I volunteered and I met with the trustee board, they adored us, because frontline volunteers are the kind of unsung workforce of a lot of charity sector kind of organizations. Every time I'm at work and we meet with our trustee board, they just can't hold enough love in their hearts for what we do. And that's a real reality, I feel. If we want to talk about getting rid of some of those barriers, there's a reality that the trustees adore the people who are volunteering and the people who are doing the work. And they need to know that volunteers in the front line don't often get time to sit down and have fish and chips with the trustee and hear why that trustee came to the position they're in. So the more we can do that and kind of break down those barriers, I think that'll just make everyone feel more cohesive. Because there's no difference in volunteering, is it? We all fill a role, commit to the wider network of the charity, and have fun doing it and give up some of our time, whether you're here or here.
That is absolutely bang on. I think that's so true. I love the flipping of it. Yeah, and I think just making sure that that cohesion happens. And also, I think it's having that flat structure, people can move back and forth. So you can be a volunteer, you can be a trustee, you can keep going back and forth, and then you're just really building the knowledge that you have of that organisation and really supporting it. Thank you. Fanny, what would you say to that, to what transfer of knowledge might there be that would really make sure that we get amazing volunteers onto boards and vice versa, just keeping that learning going?
I feel like it's a hard one to answer, because by no means our charity is perfect, but I feel like because we've got a mix of students and external people, you're kind of starting off from a good place, because there are people who bring the kind of professional background of being HRE and financey and all those other skills that I don't possess to that extent, and then you've got the people who actually understand what it's like. But I am kind of just echoing what everybody else has said as well. But I think bringing the trustees and for us it's the SLT, which is a student leadership team, if you can keep up with the higher education and no doubt charity acronyms. So, for example, for our strategy that we've started developing autumn last year, we had a trustee student leadership team, kind of a way day thing together where we were all together, but we've also got things like the officer trustees who are student leadership team members who sit on the board, of which there are two. They bring an update about what kind of volunteers and a student leadership team have been up to in the quarter gone. And then us trustees, our question back to them is kind of like, okay, so what do you need from us? So how can we support you? But certainly, so we've got some overseas trustees as well, both external and students. And I think the key is to help them understand kind of what students are about, because and the kind of value for money a lot of the time. I don't know if this is just a student union specific thing, but sometimes you need to spend a significant amount of money to because we are a distance learning university, if you want to bring 300 students together, then you're looking at 2 nights of hotel for all of them, potentially flights for some of them, carers, all sorts, and you're probably looking at like 150 to 200,000 pounds to have them together for a weekend, and kind of explaining the value of that to somebody who might have come from a corporate background. I don't think it's ever really been a challenge for us, but it's really hard to put a number on a student when we've got from a corporate perspective, we've got 170,000 students, and we probably engage with 5% of them on a good day, not over a day, over a much longer period of time, and kind of changing that perspective of external trustees. I realize I'm kind of siloing the different types of trustees that you get on a board, but I think that kind of takes time, because whilst I would go and get involved with a animal welfare charity just in my own time, you don't really, unless you're studying at a university, like I said at the start, you don't really have engagement with that particular student union. So that's perhaps a unique challenge. I don't know how much that helps.
Yeah, I think so, because it's I suppose it's about making sure that everybody within the organisation can understand the complexity of it, but also have some sight lines across it as well, which is really important to kind of foster that, you know, just that transition. Jess, what do you think? Because you also a very, very, very large organisation. So within that, how possible, you know, what do you want? What would Frontline volunteer, you know, what do trustees need to know about frontline volunteering to bring them in?
Yeah, I really like the idea actually that it is that kind of two-way dialogue that I think is really important, and I think having that ability to share on both sides, and to respect that, you know, the roles are very different and they're both equally as valid and they're both bringing something you know, very positive but different to the organization to enable it to succeed. I think that is again a challenge that we all have a role to play in trying to break down some of those barriers and those structures. I mean, this is probably, I guess, perhaps a slightly different example, but I do think there's value in thinking about mentoring and even reverse mentoring, and thinking about how actually some of those techniques or those kind of mechanisms that might be in place perhaps more in a sort of workplace setting might actually be very useful in a sort of volunteer setting as well. And as I said, you know, the kind of visit that I talked about yesterday, that sort of back to the floor. But also I think it's about ensuring that trustees are open, are accessible, thinking about very carefully how they communicate with their membership, with their volunteers. You know, we're also a membership organisation, so we have volunteers who are also members of the charity. So there's lots and lots of different kind of, as you say, different roles and overlapping roles as well. But I think actually having that really clear, open lines of communication, and as a trustee being as approachable as you can, and thinking about how you can use the opportunity, whether that's online or in-person events, to actually get out there and talk to people and hear what they have to say and listen to their experiences, but also be willing to, you know, to face some of the tough questions and think about how you can share some of the challenges that you're facing, to have that kind of ongoing two-way collaboration. And remember, you're all part of the same team, and you all believe in the mission of your charity, and that's ultimately why anybody volunteers, I think.
That's great. Such a good call on the mentoring. I think that's a really good, important thing to bring up. Yeah, and I love that idea of just talking about the challenges, because that really begins to get people to start thinking about what they're doing in a strategic manner. So thank you. We've got about 5 or 6 minutes left, and so I really want to ask each of you for your top tips for any aspiring trustee / current volunteers who are thinking, inspired now by all of you to have a go. So I'm gonna take it around the order that I have you on the screen. So Bex, do you want to go first with your top tips for anyone?
Yeah, I would say to take up any offers that are made in trustee recruitment. So often we say, if you want to have an informal chat with the board, you can do that. If you want to meet with our chair, you can absolutely do that. And I would say take up that opportunity, partly because it will help you, and partly because I think it might make you more memorable to the board as well, because you're seeing someone who's engaged and wants to learn. It also might help you realize that this isn't the board for you, or you'd rather go to a different charity or something like that. So I think the more that you can learn, the better, really. But also, sorry, not to, but also don't overdo it. Like, don't overthink it and think like, am I really qualified for this? You can just go for it.
Yeah, thank you. So you go for it, but get as much information as possible beforehand. Thank you. Jess, top tips.
Yeah, 2 things. I think one is to, as I said a little bit before, really recognise that your experiences as a volunteer are unique to you, and that actually the diversity of perspectives that you have around the board and also through others that you interact with are really, really important. And certainly in a global organisation, a global charity like ours, that appreciation of different contexts is so vital and very, very important to remember that we operate in 153 different countries. So really having that understanding. The other thing I would say is sort of linking a bit from what Beck said, it's about the sort of induction process. And I think being really clear about not being afraid to ask about the induction, the support that you can get both at the beginning, but then ongoing. And obviously there are great events like this one this week about, that kind of ongoing learning and development. And I think that is really important as a trustee. There's a lot going on in this space, particularly in the UK with the regulatory kind of landscape. And I think it's important to remember and to not just sort of think, oh, I've kind of got the role now and that's it. Actually there's a lot to learn and there's a lot that you can learn from other charities. Even if you're working in a particular sector, actually a lot of the challenges are very similar. So think about how you engage with other trustees and find people beyond your own board that you can perhaps have conversations with, relate to, share experiences with as well.
Thank you. Yeah, definitely come to more, sort of networking opportunities, places where you hear other opinions. Boards are so different. One board's so different from another. So just get as much review as possible. I agree. Rowan, what are your top tips?
If you're an aspiring trustee, there's loads of educational stuff out there. I'm a big fan of a podcast, and I know you guys have spoken on the Purposefully podcast before. Penny's been on that. And the Young Trustee Movement have got some fabulous podcasts that are just full of information, actually, that were really pivotal to me, feeling like I belonged on a trustee board. But also, once you're on that trustee board, don't let it become an echo chamber. If we're going to be strong boards, we have to have high support, but high challenge as well. And it's okay to challenge. We're not trustee boards, it's not a fan club. It's there to do a really, really important role. So it's okay to challenge and to ask more questions. And I think we've all echoed it tonight that sometimes if you don't feel very good about finances, you don't ask questions about finances, but actually sitting down with the director of the charity or the CEO or whoever it is and saying, can you just spend 5 more minutes going over that budget with me? And so that I understand it coming into that meeting is a really powerful thing to do. And it's something I do quite often. I'll ask the head of ops to go through the budget because I don't get budgets. I'm not head of ops, never will be. But that challenge is how we improve. And it's caring enough to confront is a really important step in being a trustee.
What I love about some of the answers given, actually kind of all of you, is just the forward thinking. So it's not just about getting the role, it's about how you're going to perform in the role and just thinking about constantly using your voice, because you're right, we've all become trustees to put our opinions into the room. It's great. Fanny, what are your top tips?
I think one of my top tips is definitely very similar to what everybody else said, that you've just got to kind of put yourself out there, not kind of talk yourself out of it. You do almost certainly have the skills to be a trustee, and don't be put off by this kind of idea. I think I hope it exists. Well, I don't hope it exists, but I think it exists in other parts of the charity sector as well, that you need to have X years of and having been a very senior person in very senior posts in organizations, and also that once you're on the board, don't be intimidated by other people. I did exactly what Rowan said about finance at the beginning, because I was like, I have no idea what I'm looking at here. These are just numbers for me. Like, they don't, like, I get it, it's a budget line, but like doesn't really mean anything to me. And luckily I had a finance talk me through it until I got it, and countless times. But don't let other people kind of intimidate you, because they might look quote unquote better on a CV. And I also think this is perhaps quite an undervalued thing, but also think about what you get out of it, because certainly as a volunteer and trustee, I've got a lot of employability skills. I started being a volunteer when I was 19, and now I'm in a trustee post. So really have a think about, you are obviously giving back, and that's very important, but also make sure that you're doing it in the right environment that can also help you develop it, if that's something that would benefit you.
Thank you. That's a really important point to end on. Thank you. I can see Leon is back on my screen. And it's 7:30, so I should end, but I'm going to say, is there anything I've missed? I didn't ask you about any questions, but I think I got the one.
Yeah, no, you dealt with them all, and it is 7:30, so it's time to wrap up. But thank you to not just our panelists and obviously to Fiona for chairing it, but also for all of you for coming and joining in. I'm just popping in the chat function now, the evaluation form, but also a link to the programme for the rest of the week. Well, I say rest of the week, it's just tomorrow. Although there is some networking that's happening in just a moment in this room. So if you want to stay for that, just stay in this room and we will be switching the chair position, so somebody else will chair it and we'll give you a quick comfort break. So otherwise, have a good evening and thank you very much for coming.
Thank you so much to everybody, and thank you so much to my brilliant panelists. I really enjoyed that. So many takeaways for me personally. Thank you.